Hello and welcome to the Black Ponder. I'm Neil Trotter. Today we're going to be talking about one of my personal favorite philosophers, that's Judith Butler, and we're going to be talking about one of my personal branches in philosophy, that's feminism, and we're going to be doing that via discussion of this book right here, Bodies That Matter. Bodies That Matter is basically a follow-up, or a sequel if you will, of Judith Butler's most famous text, I would say, and that's Gender Trouble. Gender Trouble is a book that shook up feminism, I think. I think it introduced gender studies, gender theory, a queer theory to a lot of people who seriously study feminism, and it forced that movement, that discipline to think about gender in ways that it didn't think about before. And that's the idea of gender and the idea of sex as it relates to gender and society. Gender Trouble, I made a video about that. One of the main themes and messages of that book is gender is performance. How we determine somebody's gender is by how they perform in society. It's almost like a performance art, an act of performativity. And it has much less to do with the way you're born in your biology. And it has a lot of implications. It has a lot of philosophical implications and a lot of societal implications. And I would encourage you to check that book out because it's definitely I would consider it a modern classic in philosophy and like one of the essential contemporary philosophical texts because it really does tackle a lot of key issues that are challenging human beings as a species really in today's world. And it does that with a philosophical approach. Or you can check out my video. Now, when that book came out, Judith Butler had a lot of discussions with contemporaries and colleagues and fellow academics. And there was a lot of questions and a few missing parts and pieces that were unanswered and unfilled and weren't really addressed in a way that they could be further addressed. So Judith Butler tries to answer a lot of those unanswered questions and some of those incomplete issues in Bodies That Matter. She's basically continuing the discussion that she left off in Gender Trouble. It's very interesting. And for me, not only is it interesting, it is very constructive. You know, we can build off of this. And that's why I think it's pretty important. So what is she talking about here in Bodies That Matter? Well, of course, at the Black Ponder, what we do is we read the quotes from the book and then we add our own supplemental commentary and discussion to try and figure out the themes of the book and see how we can apply them to our own society and to our own lives to hopefully make this world better. So I'll read you quote number 1. It's from page 26, basically at the end of the first chapter. Judith Butler writes, "Some open-ended questions remain." Okay, they remain from Gender Trouble. How is it that the presumption of a given version of matter in the effort to describe the materiality of bodies prefigures in advance what will and will not appear as an intelligible body? How do tacit normative criteria from the matter of bodies? And can we understand such criteria not simply as epistemological impositions on bodies, but as specific social regularity ideals by which bodies are trained, shaped, and formed? If a bodily schema is not simply an imposition on already formed bodies, but part of the formation of bodies, how might we be able to think the production or formative power of prohibition in the process of morphogenesis? So what's going on in this quote? Well, she wrote Gender Trouble, and then she went out in the world and shared it with the world and discussed it with fellow colleagues and academics. And a few of them came back to her and said, you know, your argument that gender is performative primarily, that's an argument you should elaborate even further in. It's not as simple as that, don't you think? You can't just stop there. A lot of them are with them and saying that, okay, gender is a lot about performance art, even more so than biology, but it's more to it than performance art. And is it really up to the performer? Or how the way they perform, is that truly their own independent action, acting out the way they want it to act out? Is that their true intention? Or are there other factors that come into play? Are there other variables and influences that force or drive the individual to perform a certain way, to act out that gender? The performance is not simply an action of the individual performer alone. The performance is done by many other factors beyond the control of the performer. And that's important to take note of, because now we're considering the sociological aspects of gender and how gender even further is determined based off of society rather than just straightforward things like biology or even just performance art or performativity, I should say. We got to delve deeper into this discussion. The question is whether the forms which are said to produce bodily life operate through the production of an excluded domain that comes to bound and to haunt the field of intelligible bodily life. The logic of this operation is to a certain extent psychoanalytic, inasmuch as the force of prohibition produces the specter of a terrifying return. Can we then turn to psychoanalysis itself to ask how the boundaries of the body are crafted through sexual taboo? Let me read you the note I put on the side on me trying to understand what's going on. I wrote, the knowledge paradigm of society materializes bodies. Bodies are not materialized on their own. So materiality is a product of psychoanalysis. So the body, when we say bodies, we're talking about individual people, how they're expressed in society, right? When you look at somebody and you're like, okay, this person is this. This is a body, or this is a female body, or this is a masculine body, or this is a feminine body. How does that come into play? How do those definitions arise? Where do they originate? And it comes from the dominant knowledge paradigm, the sociological frame that we live in, which is a patriarchal frame. This masculine, feminine, gender binary that we live in. That's a huge part of what materializes bodies, that materializes the definitions of who we are as people. And that's very important to understand, because now we're starting to understand, okay, this is a sociological situation that's going on, and how society interprets things. It goes deep into the psychological. Okay, it goes into mind. It's the mind interpreting how society wants you to be, what's acceptable. Society creates a frame of what's acceptable, and it's up to the individual to psychologically analyze what's acceptable and then act out that acceptability, perform it. It's a psychoanalytical exercise. So we shall continue with another quote. This quote actually comes from a footnote. This book has some really good footnotes. Sometimes it's good to read the footnotes of books. A lot of people skip them. Footnotes, they can have some good stuff. This book has some really good footnotes. And this quote I'm about to read is from the first chapter, and it's the 12th footnote. And I'm just gonna read it because it's very good. There is no power taken as substantive that has dissimulation as one of its attributes or modes. This dissimulation operates through the constitution and formation of an epistemic field and set of knowers. When this field and these subjects are taken for granted as prediscursive givens, the dissimulating effect of power has succeeded. Discourse designates the site at which power is installed as the historically contingent formative power of things within a given epistemic field. So what's being said here? Well, let me read you what I wrote in little side notes, just so I can try and get a handle of it. And I wrote, power does not exist on its own. Power does not exist as its own entity, as its own force. Rather, power is a byproduct or an effect. And what I wrote Rather, power is dominant realities continuously reiterating sociological norms. From this, bodies materialize. And that's what power is. Power is not its own object, or it doesn't exist independent. I want the power, I gotta have the power. Rather, it's an effect. It's a result of dominant realities, dominant knowledge paradigms taking hold of reality and expressing themselves and forcing themselves into existence and forcing people to adhere to their frame. Let me read more of that quote, footnote, try to understand what's going on here. The production of material effects is the formative or constitutive workings of power, a production that cannot be construed as unilateral movement from cause to effect. Materiality appears only when its status as contingently constituted through discourse is erased, concealed, covered over. Materiality is the dissimulated effect of power, meaning when bodies materialize, or like when you are known as a masculine male individual, like, ooh, wow, you're a very masculine male. You materializing, or that's when your body begins to matter because it adheres to the dominant paradigm of this gender binary. Like, ooh, look at you, you're very feminine. You should be a model at Vogue or something like that. Your body is beginning to materialize because it adheres to the effects of this dominant knowledge paradigm, which is patriarchy or heteronormativity. It is in this sense that materialization can be described as the sedimenting effect of regulating iterability. And then I write, as part of my notes, the reiteration of dominant realities happen iteratively to materialize bodies. So what happens is that for the dominant paradigm, or this how society is created as a norm, for the idea of the feminine or the idea of the masculine to continue to be a thing in society, to continue to be normal, it has to be reiterated over and over and over again. So when people perform to express their gender, like for example, a lady shaves their legs and their armpits to be more feminine, for instance, or a man grows a mustache really big, right, as a way to show like, ooh, I'm masculine. And that's not to say that, people who do this are always having that in mind, right? But that is a way to show your gender in this heteronormative reality that we live in, this patriarchal society that we live in, this gender binary. When we do those type of things, when a man's like, oh, I'm gonna start speaking a little bit more deeper in my voice so I can project my gender, right? All these actions, all these performative acts, right? They're just reiterations that are necessary, that have to happen for the dominant paradigm to continue, for the reality that we live in, society's normal acceptance of what gender should be. It has to keep being reiterated, and if it doesn't keep being reiterated, it's threatened and it loses its effect of power. And that's why when you see challenges to that dominant paradigm, like queer actions, like the LGBTQ community, lesbians making out on the side or something like that, or gay pride parades, when you see that type of opposition to that dominant paradigm, it's not reiterating it. It's not acting in a way that reinforces the dominant patriarchal heteronormative paradigm. And in that way, it dismantles it. And which is why there's so much negative action against those communities, against those performative actions, because they're anti-patriarchal or anti-heterosexual. So I'm going to read another footnote because these footnotes were on fire in this book, I have to say. And this is from, I don't even remember the chapter, but I'll just say it's on page 199 if you choose to follow along. And it is the footnote 23. As anticipatory, the Imago, I don't know if I'm even pronouncing that right, but the Imago is this concept that was this term that was, I guess, addressed by this thinker, Alexandre Kohave, in his introduction to the reading of Hegel. But that's not really important, the name and the terminology. What's important is the idea. So the Imago, as anticipatory, okay, is a futural projection, a proleptic and phantasmatic idealization of bodily control that cannot yet exist and that in some sense can never exist. This form situates the agency of the ego before its social determination in a fictional direction. The identificatory production of that boundary, the effect of the bounded mirror, establishes the ego as through a fictional, idealizing, and centering spatial unity. This is the inauguration of the bodily ego, the phenomenological access to morphology and to a bounded or discrete sense of the I. Of course, this constitutes a mechanisance precisely by virtue of the incommensurability that marks the relationship between that fictional projected body and the decentered, disunified bodily matrix from which the idealizing gaze emerges. To re-paraphrase Freud along Lacanian lines, then the ego first and foremost misrecognizes itself outside itself in the Imago as a bodily ego. So what does that all mean? Of course, I had to reread that several times because there's so many big words, and the notes I put on there was, the ego is a failed materialization of an ideal body in a dominant knowledge paradigm. And so, if we're talking about, we're looking at this in a Sigmund Freud type fashion, if you want to include the ego, the concept of the ego, and the ego is constantly trying to adhere to society's norms. The ego, in the Freudian sense, is your attempt to be accepted in society, or you're trying to, is your projection of an acceptable version of you that is normal in the sociological framework, right? But the problem is, this sociological framework, this normal society standard, is false. It's not true. It's just made up to express this dominant knowledge paradigm, right? This way to control the effect that is power, right? So because it's not true, it's false. It's hard for the ego or just anybody to adhere to it, because you'd have to adhere to falsehood. So you're projecting a false sense of yourself. And so you fail because you're never true to yourself. And so the materialization of yourself, how you materialize it in society, how you become an individual in society, is a failure, because that's never your true self. So your ego is a failure always. And that's why what's going on gender-wise is such a travesty, because we're always trying to be something that we're not, or at least many people out there are trying to adhere to these impossible standards that gender creates in this as to be acceptable in society. So let's continue here with this other quote. This is from, is this the last chapter? I believe so. It's called Critically Queer, and it's from page 178. Gender is neither a purely psychic truth conceived as internal and hidden, nor is it reducible to a surface appearance. On the contrary, its undecidability is to be traced as the play between psyche and appearance, where the latter domain includes what appears in words. Further, this will be a play regulated by heterosexist constraints, though not for that reason fully reducible to them. In no sense can it be concluded that the part of gender that is performed is therefore the truth of gender. Performance as bounded act is distinguished from performativity insofar as the latter consists in a reiteration of norms which precede, constrain, and exceed the performer, and in that sense cannot be taken as a fabrication of the performer's will or choice. So that's what's happening here, what we're talking about here. In Judith Butler's previous work, Gender Trouble, you can come away with that, from that book, thinking like, oh, gender's, it's just an act of performance, is performativity. So it's the way an individual performs, that's how gender is expressed. But no, it's actually a lot more deeper than that. Yeah, that's part of it, but also you have to understand that the way the individual is performing to express their gender is not completely 100% an act of will by the performer. There's other factors that are coming into play. The impossibility to adhere to the social standard of what gender is, that's coming into play as well. So even when the performer is performing an action that goes against the normal idea of gender, they're still acting within the rule set of that gender. It might be against it, but they're still reacting to it. And so are they really truly performing the way they are truthfully, or are they just simply reacting to the sociological framework, not the dominant knowledge paradigm of society? Patriarchy, heteronormativity, the gender binary. You're either male or you're female, and that's it. And all the standards that go on along with that. Whether you're acting for or against it, you're still acting as a result of that. And it's very difficult to truly act in the way you truthfully are. And I put as this note, basically what I said, gender is the product of societal framing, heteronormativity. That's what gender is. So let's continue. What is gender? I read you this final quote. Also from the footnotes, because the footnotes are just the bomb here in this book, I have to say. This is on page 215. It's from footnote 11. Intentionality within phenomenology does not mean voluntary or deliberate, but is rather a way of characterizing consciousness or language as having an object, more specifically as directed toward an object which may or may not exist. In this sense, an act of consciousness may intend, posit, constitute, apprehend an imaginary object. Gender, in its ideality, might be construed as an intentional object, an ideal, which is constituted but which does not exist. So I put gender is a false reality. So gender doesn't really exist, right? It is just a construct created by society to enforce a set of standards, to make sure certain people are put in check, just to make sure that reality complements certain people in certain ways, and make sure other people are put in check. Gender is simply a method, a function to enforce a reality, but it's not real in the sense that it's not true. It doesn't actually express how individuals really are, or how the truth of an individual. So in that sense, any attempt to address gender or adhere to a gender or even go against the idea of gender, you are reacting to this false reality, this false construct. And this is important to understand, because what it shows and what it tells us is that we live in a false world. We live in a world that exists in false constructs. And day by day we perform and we act and we identify in ways that aren't true reflections of who we actually are. We're just acting, performing, doing things that help us adhere to the standards of society, so that we can exist in this society, in this dominant society of patriarchy, of heteronormativity, this gender binary. We have to adhere, we have to have these false reflections of ourselves to exist in this false reality that is society. So how do we be true to ourselves? Well, first we got to understand that society itself is false. It's built off of falsehood, and it's just a way to keep people in check and keep power in certain circles and away from other circles of people. And then we got to dismantle the falsehood and start considering the true nature of reality. This is philosophy at its finest, in my opinion. We're talking about things that matter, bodies that matter. Check it out, Judith Butler's Bodies That Matter. Well, you're listening to The Black Ponder. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.